we begin, we would like to invite Mr. Rwanda Agung Sugardiman to give the keynote speech for today's session. To Mr. Rwanda, the stage is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege and great pleasure to welcome you to our event on unfolding the first NDC in 2020 and action and beyond, which I believe is in line with our theme here in COP25, Time for Actions. It has been 4 years since the world leaders signed the Paris Agreement on climate change and pledged to keep the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level and to work to keep the increase as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Every country on every continent is now affected by climate change, which is disrupting national economic development, affecting lives, costing people, communities, and countries today and even more tomorrow. The changing is of weather pattern, the rising of sea level and weather events are becoming more extreme, as well as the continued rising the greenhouse gas emission are the evidence of this global change. Without action, the global temperature is likely to surpass 2 degrees Celsius this century, and the poorest and the most vulnerable community are being affected the most. Please allow me to recall the Paris Agreement 2015 was highlighted as a momentum to move forward together to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change, which all countries agreed to work to curb the global temperature rise to degrees Celsius above the era prior to mass industrialization, with an aspiration to limit this to 1.5 degrees Celsius based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, which are stipulated in their NDCs. Ladies and gentlemen, the current and the most expected IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius mentioned that the more ambitious 1.5 degrees Celsius goal would require a precipitous drop in greenhouse gas emission triggered by the rapid phase-out of fossil fuel, mass development of solar, the wind energy, and the eradication of emission from cars, trucks, and airplanes. We also have here some event related to recent IPCC finding on ocean, which figure latest scientific knowledge on the physical science base and impact of climate change on ocean, coastal, polar, and mountain ecosystem, as well as the evaluation of the vulnerabilities of human communities and adaptation capacities. The IPCC special report related to land and climate change provide an updated assessment of the current state of the knowledge on land-related topics since the 5th assessment report and the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The term of post-2020 action under NDC and action beyond NDC, a massive and immediate transformation of climate movement will be required to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, such as in generating energy, using transportation, using the best available technology and growing food, and other potential actions. Furthermore, affordable and scalable solutions are now available to enable countries to leapfrog to more carbon-less and climate-resilient economies. The pace of change is quickening as more people are turning to renewable energy and range to other measures that will reduce emissions and increase adaptation efforts. Although there are available technology which will enable countries to leapfrog, I would like to highlight that there is a need for developing countries for having transition phase in the transformation process to enable us to jump to low carbon development pathway. If countries do not change course by 2020, we will risk missing the point where we can avoid runaway climate change with disastrous consequences for people and all of the natural system that sustain us. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, today we have invited an outstanding group of highlight respective colleagues to address challenge to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius as the Paris Agreement have been targeted through NDC implementations. Our event is designed to share and to learn from some parties, developing country parties, and international institutions in elaborating the first NDC into concrete implementation and action, as well as to seek parties in vision in order to elaborate the upcoming updated NDC and low carbon long-term strategy as mandated by Paris Agreement. In this event, we could also seek our potential for reaching NDC target and its mean of implementation, as well as identify the linkage and the mandate of Paris Agreement and potential for raising ambition, including strategy in engaging non-party stakeholders. Therefore, it is my hope that this meeting will have some outcome as we expected, which will be beneficial in finding possible solution to pursue and shape a low carbon climate resilient global community. Thank you very much for your presence here, and I wish you all productive deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rwanda, for the keynote speech. Without further delay, I would like to welcome the moderator of the session, Mr. Wahyudi Wardoyo, Senior Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Forestry. To Mr. Wahyudi, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Atika. Good afternoon, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Indonesia Pavilion this afternoon. After we are having a DG of climate change keynote address, so I'd like to invite 5 speakers from different institutions and countries. First, Mr. Philip Diaz, Chile negotiator, please. I heard that you just have a short time, please. The second speaker will be Mr. Pamela Lee from Singapore. The third speaker will be Mr. John Morton from COP26 Envoy United Kingdom. Not yet. And then Mr. Romeo Pertolini, NDC Partnerships. Please, coming, sir. Yeah. While we are waiting for the other speakers, we are going to invite the speaker here. Firstly, Mr. Diaz, to give presentations how Chile doing on NDC and related to that kind of action. Please, Mr. Diaz.
First of all, thank you all. Good afternoon. Do you hear now? This is better? Okay, this is better. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. I would like to excuse myself because I'm in the middle of some negotiations, so I will present our NDC specifically on the part of mitigation in Chile, and after that we will have a small round of questions, and then unfortunately I will have to go, but let's go. Chile has been working on the update of the NDC during this year. On this point, we have our NDC under public consultation. In fact, it ended a couple of days ago, so now we are in the process of reviewing all the comments that we received, that in this moment are around 60 comments that we received from the public sector, private sector, and the academia, and other ministries. So first of all, we need to decide or look forward on what to do with our NDC. Our NDC was, the first one was created for 2015 and has some objectives that on those days, after some other science breakthrough, had been outdated. So our objective is again to maintain the global average temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, and looking forward to not getting above 1.5 degrees. So there are two things. We need to achieve emission neutrality by 2050. Also, it's not the same if we decrease our emissions now or in 2040, just to give an example. So we need to have a peak of emission as soon as possible. So our message at the end of the day to start working on our mitigation part for the NDC was to limit the increase of temperature using the emissions reduction of the country. So why we have to do that? Because we understand that having a carbon emission increase every year will have a concentration increase every year, and that will give us the increment on temperature. So every time that we have this increase on carbon emission, we have this increase on the concentration, and then again an increase on the temperature. The problem is that even if we kind of close the water key and we stop emitting 1 year from 1 year to the another, the concentration will still be very high, and the decrease of this is going to take years and years, and the same will happen with the temperature. So that gives us the urgency to not only get to the neutrality soon, but also get a peak of emission as soon as possible. Also, we take into consideration the information from the IPCC Special Report 1.5 that between all the information that gave us, worked with the carbon budget of the whole country, and that we use that carbon budget to have using information from several universities to recognize that Chile also have a carbon budget. Having the carbon budget from the country, we also needed to know that we knew how much carbon we could emit. But what we also needed to consider is that how to reach this neutrality is not the same from one projection and another. We needed to have a peak on these emissions as soon as possible. Having those 2 points that are very important, we then jump to the next step. What makes an NDC ambitious? We needed to be aligned with the commitments of the Convention and on the Paris Agreement. We needed to have a long-term vision to guide the commitment, so our NDC, it's kind of aligned to a long-term strategy that now Chile is working on, that I will jump to that later on. And it needs to have a transparent goal that are easy to follow by us, by other countries, and then to be part of the global stock, be useful for the global stock. And for sure, it needs to be science-based. So one of the things that Chile took into consideration this year, and it was included on the framework in the climate change framework law, was a goal that tells us that in 2050 Chile needs to be carbon neutral. This law right now was written during this year. Also went to public consultation, which was an incredible process because we got more than 2,000 inputs from the public sector, academia, private sector, and then we, after a process of reviewing this consultation, it's going to go to the ministries, the Council of Ministries for Climate Change, and then it's going to go to the Congress, probably the next one. This one is very important because by law, we're going to commit to reach neutrality by 2050. We're going to have, by law, a long-term goal that is going to be aligned later on for the long-term strategy, and then stay with our NDCs. The national efforts also give us the need to have a commitment not only from our ministry, but also other stakeholders, as in this case we get the responsibility for other ministries, Ministry of Transport, Urbanism, Minery, Agriculture, Forestry, and Finance. So all of them, plus Energy, will be working with us. I mean, they worked in the past, but now with the law, they're going to have the mandatory it will be mandatory the need to help us providing us information and also some mitigation and adaptation plans that will help us and will be an input to keep working on our next NDCs and on our long-term strategy. So for the mitigation NDC, we have it our reference scenario or BAU, and then with the projections and all the mitigation measures that we get to know by different groups of discussion we had in the country during the 2018 and 19, where different ministries, private sector, and academia were working on. We defined which were the technology or the implementation measures that needed to be were needed to be able to achieve a neutrality for 2050. As you can see on the graph, the emissions for 2050 are not zero, but that is part of the compensation that will come from the forestry commitment. So basically, what we identify on all this group of discussion, that we are going to consider measure in renewable energy, withdrawal of coal-fired power plants, and so on. Finally, our NDC mitigation target is being updated to this one, which has several considerations. It's going to have a carbon budget that is going to be between 1,100 and 1,175 megatons of CO2 equivalent. There's going to be a peak of emission before 2027, and we need to reach emission levels of 97 megatons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. So we are going to have a cumulative emission. We have a point that we want to reach for 2030, and also we're expecting to have a peak on 2027. So we're trying to get all this detail into the in control to have a carbon budget that can be measured year by year. An example of displaying this budget is, as you can see, as it follows. We have a quantity of emission for 2020 until 2030, where in 2027 we have already a peak of emissions, or 109 in this example. And then if we add up all this year, we have the accumulative budget that we are expecting to have in our NDC target. All of this work has been worked closely with the projections from the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Environment, using the data that was given by the Ministry of Agriculture, Economy, Minery, and all the others that are a big part of the mission in the country. So with that, we can reach an amount of emissions. Then we will need to have some things to get to neutrality. There's no way for Chile to get carbon neutral without things. But so on, we have improved our first goal for our first NDC, committing to a sustainable management and recovery of 2,000 hectares of native forest, and also 2,000 hectare forest in which at least 100 hectares correspond a permanent forest cover that will be included in the forest goal. We also are going to reduce forest sector emission from native forest degradation and deforestation by 25 by 2030. All these goals were closely identified and working on with the Ministry of Agriculture, for sure. So in conclusion, what we get to know from the process of the updating of the NDC during this year and the past one is that we needed to focus on the peak as soon as possible. It wasn't only the need to reach a certain amount, we needed also to manage the curve of decreasing. We needed a compromise, a strong compromise for neutrality for 2050. So that in that idea, the framework law was a very good instrument that we can use. The cumulative emission target is something good that we can use year by year later on to generate new strategies. We needed to be more transparent and ambitious, because the previous NDC of Chile, who has an intensity commitment that was related to the GDP, wasn't that transparent enough, because it was easy to say that our intensity commitment was decreasing. We were reaching the goal, but above that we were increasing our emission anyway. So we need something more transparent to work with the people and the other ministries. It was needed to develop and define the NDC with NGOs, academia, the private and the public sector, and all the levels. And this was very important also to have public consultations, so people will ensure and will give us more inputs, and they will also approve all the changes that we're doing. For example, if then the next year we need to start increasing, just to give an example, the taxes on fuels, people will know that because people are already engaged on these needs. And here it doesn't appear, but something also that is very important for Chile at this point, now that we are starting to work on our long-term strategy, is that the process of the NDC is a process that we get to get a lot of information and knowledge that we will use for the long-term strategy. We have teams that we already are working together for each sector, that now we are going to work with them again for the long-term strategy. The information that we accumulate from these workshops are going to be a fundamental and a baseline for all the work, all the needs that has a long-term strategy. The final goal for 2050 that we define on the law through the NDC also will help us to identify where is the reaching point. And then all the strategies that we define on the long-term strategy will help us to be updating the next NDCs, and then we are going to create a change of effort that will just will help us just to give a small extra effort to be updating all our compromises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz. Could you stay here because I heard you have to go earlier from
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
So that's why I like to invite some comments and questions from the audiences to Mr. Diaz from Chile. Yes, first, and then later on the second lady.
Muchas gracias, señor. My name is Anggi from Madani, Indonesia. It's amazing that Chile already has a peak year ambition. My question would be, how was the revision, the process to get the new NDC, the revision and enhancement process, and how did you ensure civil society and IP participation in that process? Could you elaborate on that? Thank
Okay,
you.
okay, let me go with the second question on the engagement of the people. One of the key points is that the Ministry of Environment, even if it's not mandatory, we always go by public consultation. We try to get to people to embrace all the process, or at least at the end of the process, they comment on the product. But also, in all from the beginning of the process, we try to create this workshop that are we call the academia and the private sector, and also other NGOs, and the NGOs receive their direct comment from the public sector. So in that point, I will say and also we sometimes do some workshop. For example, what we did in the past month for the NDC, we knew that because of the situation of Chile, and also because Chile has a geography that is not so easy to people to get to the capital, we decided to do some online workshops. So we presented the NDC across online using just online measures, and then all people from all the country could be able to see what we were doing, and then also they can make questions there, and we get those questions, and then in a next session we respond them. And the first question was, sorry? Oh, the resign this process, yeah. So taking in consideration the first process of the NDC, we also used that and also the learning lessons that we got, because we, of course, it was our first NDC for everybody, and we didn't know how to do it. So we had a process, we did things good, another bad. So we took those two, and then we tried to fix them, the one that were bad, and getting help from the people that were involved in that process, because the Ministry of Environment has the benefit that is a very technical team, so they have been in the whole two NDCs. They help us all a lot in discovering which were the failures that we get in the first process, and then we overcome those in the second.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, second question is the lady.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. My name is Choma, and I'm from Nigeria, and I'm the Dex Officer for NDC. So I was not here when you did your presentations, and I don't know if you have talked about it before now, but my question is this. In order to increase your NDC, review your NDC, of course, it is very important that you become more ambitious. Are you focusing on the sectors that was on the NDC, or are you including some of the new sectors to the NDC? And if you're including some of the new sectors in the ND, how did you tackle the issues of data? Did you rerun the models again? Because this is the challenge we're facing in Nigeria. We have the desire to increase ambition and also add more sector, but we don't have resources or maybe technical support in order to collate data in those sectors, and it's becoming a very long process, and the time frame is very small. So what is the experience of your country? Thank you.
It's better to give more questions, please.
Maybe.
Yeah, continue question first.
Okay.
Because there are
I am Abdullahi Babara. I come from Nigeria, North Central, part of Nigeria. I work within the SDG Sustainable Development Goal called Cycle. Let me first commend your effort in the well-detailed presentation.
Thank you.
Part of your presentation that I'm very keen or curious to know is along the perspective of localizing the SDGs, particularly in the area of environmental degradation, that is environmental management. Among the process, you highlighted the mitigation process or strategy. You made mention of withdrawal of coal fire plant, electromobility, transport, which are very good. But you see, from the area or region I come from, the local people, my local people, most of them solely depend on these economic trees by cutting them down, then converting them to charcoal as a source of their livelihood. So I want you to please point out to us the immediate alternative strategy for us to move away from this issue of coal, this charcoal usage, so that if you are denying them the use of coal, how in their own local initiative? So that how do we move them away to go through this new invention? Then again,
you make it shorter.
Yeah, okay. Among the sustainable management, you may mention that you wish to achieve about 200 hectares of forest by 2030. So please, I want you to put it to us or educate us. We cannot say we will achieve 200, even if it is 100 hectares, given by the locality I come from. I wish to know so that we can share experience on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
The last one, please.
Thank you. I'm Andrei from Slovenia. Thank you for your presentation. I have one question. Maybe I missed something, but you showed on the graph that this is neutrality, that orange line.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But it's still substantial emissions in 2050.
Yeah.
So in what sense is it neutrality? Because it is still above your base year of 1990. So I say, probably I missed something. Why is it neutrality where the emissions are still rather high?
Okay, yeah. So I will start with that one. The neutrality is reached because because we are gonna use also the sinks from all the forestry that we have in Chile, and also that are related to the commitment on increasing the hectares of native forest, and we are gonna use that as a sink, and that will help us to reach the neutrality. Just to go a little bit in order, related to the SDGs were taken in consideration because Chile created a strategy, 2030 strategy was called Estrategia 2030. We took in consideration all the SDGs, and that was also part of an input of our NDC and the long-term strategy. I just mentioned in our NDC the mitigation part, but also we have an adaptation which has a relation with circular economy, water use, social and gender issues, and maybe I'm forgetting something, capacity building. So it's there. Today I didn't present it, but you can also search online on the Ministry of Chilean site. It's public, so you can look for it. Maybe in a next occasion, I can show you that. Related the old NDC and the new one and the sector, and on the first question, we have, it's not good luck, but the thing is, the emissions coming from in Chile are coming always from the same sectors, mostly from energy, and secondly agriculture in a fewer amount, and in energy also transport. So the sector didn't change too much. But something that is very important to mention is the working with the private sector, because private sector, if you don't have the data by the government, they could have it. So it's a good kind of shortcut to get previous year information. And maybe, I think those are the questions. I'm not sure if there was something else. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz, for your presentation.
And I'm so sorry.
Excellent. Yes, please. We allow you to leave your Thank you very much. The second speaker, I'd like to invite Ms. Pamela Lee, Director, Policy and Planning of the National Climate Change Secretariat of Singapore. Please, President.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first extend my thanks to Indonesia for having us here in this very beautiful pavilion. Today I'm here to share more about Singapore's climate actions, both with regard to our NDC as well as the development of our long-term strategy, which is still underway at the moment. This is the outline of my presentation today. Firstly, I just wanted to say that Singapore is already experiencing the impacts of climate change. Whether it's in terms of more dry spells, whether it's in terms of higher temperatures, whether it's in terms of more intense rainfalls. Singapore is a city-state, and we are a small, low-lying island state, which means that rising sea levels, which is a very real impact of climate change, is an existential issue for Singapore. And within our very small and constrained land area, we have to accommodate housing, commercial centers, our air and our seaports, and we're highly urbanized, as well as having a very high population density. And this means that we have very limited alternative energy options because of our limited land area. We have low wind speeds, we have a low tidal range, we have a lack of geothermal resources, and we don't have any large river systems for hydropower. And so our biggest hope is solar power. But even with the deployment of solar energy, we are limited by our limited land area. Solar being the most feasible, we have to overcome several challenges in order to be able to deploy more solar. For example, the competing use of space, the fact that not all surfaces are suitable, managing the impact of solar deployment on biodiversity when we try and deploy solar on our reservoirs and on coastal regions, as well as trying to increase the efficiency of solar cells. However, we're still trying to continue to push the boundaries with regard to the deployment of solar. And very recently, we just announced that we are hoping to increase our solar target to at least 2 gigawatt peak by 2030. And this will account for about 4% of our total electricity demand today. We are also trying to innovate in terms of the various forms of deployment. So for example, we have put floating solar panels on our reservoirs. And we are also trying to put more solar on vacant land, which is mobile, so that during the time when this land is not in use, we can use it to harness the power from the sun. But when the land is going to be used, we will then shift this mobile solar panels elsewhere. We're also trying to push the boundaries to see how we can incorporate solar even on the facades of our buildings. We have a Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore, which places research in terms of increasing deployment, especially with regard to increasing the efficiency of solar panel cells. This is our total emissions profile. In 2014, we stood at 50.91 million tons. Our 2030 NDC is to reduce emissions intensity by 36% below 2005 levels by 2030 and to stabilize emissions with the aim of peaking around 2030. We also highlighted in our NDC that we aim to peak around 2030 at 65 million tons. This NDC is an economy-wide coverage including all sectors, and it also includes all greenhouse gases. Preparations are currently underway for us to update and enhance our NDC very soon, and we will review our NDC target. We hope to enhance the transparency of our NDC given the latest IPCC guidance as well as ICTU, and we also hope to be able to provide more information on how we are implementing our NDC. In order to be able to implement our NDC, there are a whole range of mitigation measures that we are putting in place in the various sectors. Chile talked about how we have to talk about mitigation measures in each sector so that this can be concretized. And it is the same in Singapore, whether it's in terms of our power sector, where we hope to increase solar deployment, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's in our water and waste sector, where we hope to be able to double our water supply without using more energy. We hope to increase the overall recycling rate from 61% to 70% by 2030. We have a vision to become a zero-waste nation. And we also have introduced the extended producer responsibility to manage e-waste. For the household sector, we have implemented mandatory energy labeling scheme as well as minimum energy performance standards. In our building sector, we hope to green our buildings, 80% of our buildings by 2030. In the transport sector, we already have capped private vehicular growth to 0%, which means you cannot have another private vehicle on the road unless you deregister a private vehicle. We have also been encouraging commuters to walk, to cycle, or to take public transport. And by 2040, we hope that 90% of all journeys made during the peak hour will be made either by public transport or by walking or by shared mobility. We are also doubling our rail network by 2030 to 360 kilometers. In industry sector, which is where the bulk of our emissions are, we hope to sustain energy efficiency improvements to 1 to 2% per annum. And in 2017, we saw energy efficiency improvement rates of 1.4%. Underpinning all of these measures is a carbon tax, which complements and sharpens the incentive by providing a price signal. We started the carbon tax just this year at $5 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions for a transition period of 5 years, and we hope to double to triple this carbon tax rate by 2030. This is an economy-wide carbon tax with no exemptions, no free allowances, and it covers around 80% of our emissions, one of the highest coverage in the world. It complements other measures, as I said earlier, by providing an economy-wide price signal to promote behavioral change, incentivize more efficient use of resources, and to encourage the deployment of low-carbon technologies. Climate change doesn't just pose threats to us, it also presents opportunities. And Singapore aims to be a green finance hub, to be a leading center for green finance in Asia and globally. And we hope to be able to leverage green finance to drive more climate action in the region. We also hope to spur investments in renewables technology, grid infrastructure, battery storage, green buildings, efficient cooling, and industry systems. We aim for Singapore to be a living lab, where there can be collaboration between businesses, research institutes to test bit clean technologies under real-world conditions in Singapore. If it works in Singapore, hopefully this can then be scaled up, can be developed, and can be exported elsewhere, where this is how we can play our small part as well in contributing to mitigation options elsewhere. Very recently, the Monetary Authority of Singapore laid out what it hopes to be our Green Finance Action Plan, where we want to build our financial system to be more resilient to environmental risks, both in Singapore and regionally and beyond. We also hope to develop more green finance solutions and markets in Singapore. For example, since the launch of the Sustainable Green Bond Grant Scheme in 2017, more than $6 billion worth of green bonds have issued so far in Singapore. We also just announced $2 billion worth of funds to support green investment strategies under the Green Investment Program. We also hope to leverage innovation and technology to harness the power of fintech to spur more green finance. As I mentioned earlier, Singapore aims to be a living laboratory, and these are some examples of test beds in Singapore. For example, under the Renewable Energy Integrated Demonstrator Singapore, this is a hybrid microgrid test and research platform that is on Pulau Semakau, which is where our landfill is. And we hope to test and demonstrate the integration of solar, wind, tidal, storage, and waste-to-energy technologies. We have also committed under our Research and Innovation Enterprise 2020 $900 million towards R&D in urban solutions and sustainability to tackle Singapore's energy, water, and waste and land mobility challenges. We believe that if these solutions are successful in Singapore, we will be able to export them elsewhere and hopefully contribute to global climate action. Singapore actively participates in the UNFCCC negotiations, and we also support efforts by international organizations, for example, ICAO and IMO. We also collaborate with international partners to exchange climate-friendly best practices. In 2018, we launched the Climate Action Package, which helps ASEAN member states to develop capacity in areas such as climate science, flood management, disaster risk reduction. And we also established the Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility in tandem with the World Bank and Japan, where it's a platform for ASEAN member states to access disaster risk financing solutions and to increase financial resilience to climate and disaster risks. We also host the WMO Regional Office and the ASEAN Specialized Med Center. Securing a smooth, low-carbon transition is a challenge that every party has to undertake, and Singapore has to adjust to a low-carbon world. Managed well, we see that this is not at odds with economic growth, because improving resource efficiency can improve international competitiveness, and we can leverage innovation and technology to create green growth opportunities. And so we are currently developing Singapore's long-term strategy to ensure that Singapore continues to be well-positioned to grow sustainably even in a carbon-constrained future. And this requires not just a whole of government, but a whole of society, a whole of nation effort, including government, businesses, non-governmental organizations, and consumers to make this transition. Businesses, Singapore businesses are already taking action. For example, Temasek Holdings has committed to be a carbon neutral company by 2020, and for its supporting portfolio of companies to reduce their carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. We have just concluded a public consultation exercise on our long-term low emissions development strategy. And just like Chile, we actually received more than 2,000 inputs from the private sector, from green groups, from academics, on how Singapore might be able to make this transition. And we aim to be able to publicly release the government's responses to all this feedback, as well as a summary of all this feedback next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee. Could you stay there, and then we are going to have a question after the last speaker. Yeah, you may sit down.
Oh, sure.
I'd like to invite the last speakers, Mr. Bertolini from NDC Partnership. So anyone wants to ask to Madam Lee, please keep it for a while. We are going to have a question after Mr. Bertolini presentation, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Robert Bradley. Actually, I'm standing in for my colleague Romeo Bertolini this afternoon. I'll be speaking without slides, so it's fortunate that we are in such a beautiful pavilion today. So if you get tired of looking at my face, please allow your eyes to wander around the beautiful surroundings. Many thanks to Indonesia for the kind invitation to join you here today. I want to do three things, really. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the NDC partnership, what it is, and the work that we've been doing together. Then I want to talk about what the partnership is doing to support its members in going through the process of enhancing NDCs. And then finally, I want to talk in line with the topic of the day, how that is interacting with the way in which countries that we're working with are thinking about long-term strategies and how long-term strategies and the NDCs interact with each other. So the NDC partnership is a coalition of now 104 member countries. I'm happy to say that includes Indonesia, it includes Singapore, it includes Chile, as well as 101 others. Together with about 35 intergovernmental organizations and around 25 non-governmental associate members. And all of these members have come together in the determination to work together in new ways so as to accelerate the implementation of the NDCs and to enhance our collective ambition over time. We're currently active in about 65 countries around the world. And when I say active, I mean that the partnership has had direct requests for support from its member countries, and the various members of the partnership are active in responding to those requests. We work together in now three broad ways. The first of those ways is through what we call the country engagement process. So when we receive a formal request from the country, our job, and I work for a support unit, which is a kind of little secretariat to the partnership, we share that request with all members, and we support the government in going through a cross-government and indeed whole-of-society approach to producing what we call a partnership plan. So together, we support the government in producing a single plan which articulates all of the technical assistance needs and increasingly the project finance needs that the government has in order to successfully accelerate its NDC implementation. By working together, that means that there's a single government-owned process by which all of the other partners are aligned. So rather than having a lot of different bilateral discussions, there's a clear government-led strategy that everyone else can align support around. The kinds of support that governments are seeking is, of course, very varied. Sometimes it's highly specific, just one or two particular things. So in Costa Rica, for instance, there was already an NDC implementation plan, and the partnership is working to turn that into an investment plan so that project finance can be brought to bear. In some cases, it's very comprehensive. So St. Lucia, for instance, recently approved its partnership plan at cabinet level, and that adopted that as the formal implementation plan for its NDC. So it's a flexible process. It responds to the needs of countries as the government itself requests. The second way in which we work together is by moving beyond individual country experiences and creating a space for knowledge and learning. So we support direct dialogue between our members, for instance, so that countries can learn directly from each other's experiences. We will, in fact, next month have an event hosted by Singapore, which is specifically to allow an exchange amongst some of our member countries on the question of NDC enhancement. We build platforms to allow members to more quickly access appropriate technical resources. I would encourage you to see our website and the knowledge portal thereon, as well as by sharing stories. You're all very welcome to come to the NDC Partnership Pavilion, where our members will be producing around 70 events over the course of the COP to share their experiences. The third way in which we work is around supporting the NDC enhancement process. And so this takes me to the second of my topics, really where the partnership is in terms of NDC enhancement. Earlier this year in July, we launched what we call the Climate Action Enhancement Package. And this was a program of support for member countries that wish to go through the process of enhancing their NDCs next year and who have specific needs in order to be able to do that effectively. We've been through 2 rounds of proposals, and the Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP as we call it, is now supporting 65 countries in that process. The kinds of things that countries have requested, again, varies widely, but it includes, for instance, the resources needed to hold whole of government or whole of state, whole of society consultation processes. to undertake analysis like vulnerability assessments of certain sectors, to undertake economic assessments, to be able to assess different options and decide what elements of enhancement would work best for the country. And so we're all working together very hard. Many of my colleagues are not sleeping at the moment to turn all of that into support on the ground by the beginning of the year so that countries have the duration of the year in order to go through that process. What kinds of things are we seeing our member countries do in order to enhance? Again, it's very varied. So in some cases, countries went through a very rapid process in 2015 to produce the NDC that they have today. And so their NDCs are focused in perhaps on certain sectors or certain activities. Many countries, for instance, set a target within the energy sector, but didn't necessarily assess what could be done in other sectors. So many of our members are looking at, okay, what happens now if we explore how to include land use or waste management or transport? In some cases, countries are interested in re-examining the targets they set, but having a deeper set of analysis around that so that they can inform those decisions and understand what the economic and the social impacts would be. So they're looking at economic analysis and so forth. In some cases, they're adding adaptation and resilience dimensions to what's happening. In some cases, it's a question of aligning the things that are in the NDC more fully with national strategies that are already being set. In many countries, there are actually different targets within the NDC and within national policy, because these are, of course, developed by different ministries at different times with different priorities. And so increasingly, countries are engaged in the process of aligning all of those. And of course, that's at the heart of what NDCs need to be about. Ultimately, NDCs will not be successful if they are climate policies that are put in place in parallel to key national priorities. Ultimately, NDCs are only going to be successful if they embody the development goals that countries have for themselves and help actually advance that development agenda. And so that's key to how countries are thinking about NDC enhancement. So that takes me really to the third point, which is how does this all link to long-term strategies? And we have received a lot of requests that are related to long-term strategy development within the context of NDC enhancement. In many cases, probably in more than half of the countries that have requested support with NDC enhancement, a part of that support is about aligning the goals of the NDC with those established in longer-term strategies. But the additional point that I want to emphasize is that long-term strategies in this sense doesn't necessarily mean just a long-term strategy that is created for the purpose of meeting the terms of the Paris Agreement. In many cases, long-term strategies in countries means long-term development strategies in the energy sector or in land use and agriculture. It means long-term planning for the resilience of infrastructure that might be threatened by the future impacts of climate change. It means aligning what the NDCs do with long-term development goals in the realms of health, education, economic development. So the big takeaway that we have every day as we work with our members is that the way in which countries approach these questions of long-term strategy setting and of NDCs needs to be flexible. Countries have an extraordinarily wide array of different national circumstances, of different national priorities, of capacities, and of near-term goals. And that means that whatever is done within the NDC needs to be embedded thoroughly in the development planning cycles, in the development goals and aspirations that the country has set for itself. And within the context of each of those, we have had the privilege of working with our members to try, therefore, to align the support that comes from all kinds of different players, whether that's bilateral support, multilateral organizations, NGOs, or others, is made coherent with the strategic priorities that governments set for themselves. And that's where I think this next round of NDC planning and enhancement can be so exciting, because we have the experience of the first round of NDC implementation. We have maybe we can give ourselves a little bit more time this year than some countries had in the run-up to 2015, and that alignment can be made more profound, and we can help drive both development goals and and climate protection together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert Lee. Yeah, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I received information. Yeah, please keep your question first. But I received information that the representative from UK is also in the room. This is Mr. Davis. Could you come here, or probably you may sit in front of us? He is head of UK delegation in COP26. Oh, you may sit here. Yeah, Mr. Davis, I heard that you don't want to have a kind of presentations, but you may give a kind of comments or whatever information from us before the other question. Could you, please?
Is this on? Yeah,
Yes.
great. Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Hugh Davis, I'm head of the UK delegation. Thank you very much for having me here today. Sorry, because of a mix-up over the time, I wasn't here for the whole presentation. As was said, unfortunately, because we have an election next week, I'm kind of my hands are tied in terms of what I can present. So what I'm primarily here for is as a representative of the incoming COP26 presidency. Hopefully you're all aware that the UK has been nominated to host the COP next year. And so we have a real interest in how countries are taking forward their NDCs. And it's also been a long-term interest. The NDCs are really at the heart of the Paris Agreement, as the previous speakers are saying, and they're really where everything comes together, not just in terms of our collective efforts to try and meet the long-term mitigation goals in the Paris Agreement, but also how we share information about how we're tackling that. And we have a lot of experience in the UK, both in terms of our Climate Change Act that's been around for 10 years, our long-term strategy that was released a couple of years ago, and also our net zero emissions target that was set this year, that we're always happy to share with partners and talk to more about, and that I could, to be honest, couldn't give justice to now. So we're always happy to work with all of you and work with partners here on taking forward NDCs. But my main message really for today was how important this is to the Paris process, how important it is for us as the COP26 presidency next year, and how we want to work with all countries next year to make sure that from COP26 we really set the direction, set the ambition needed to take us towards the long-term mitigation goals of the Paris Agreement. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Ladies and gentlemen, now we come into the session to question and answer. So we have three different speakers, and I think there are a lot of interesting information from them, and I think all of you is going to ask for them. So I like to invite questions first, ladies, second and third, fourth, fifth. There's 5 of questions. Please be short, so give time for the other to give a question as well. Yeah, first, lady. Yeah.
Okay, I still Choma from Nigeria, and I'm very delighted to be here with you and also to listen to very interesting presentation that you made today. So my first question goes to the lady from Singapore. It's very overwhelming to see what you have done on the issues of mitigating the emissions in your country. But my question is this: Nigeria has issued first and second national green bond for climate actions, and this green bond has been focused on emission reduction projects. But the issue that is very interesting to me is that we need to do carbon taxation. And I don't know the processes of how we're going to start, because we have a very wide range of private sector in my country. So does it start with a legal act? Does it start with maybe parliamentary bills and all that? So I just want to have the experience that you have while starting your own carbon taxation. So second question is to the NDC partnership. I am very excited to listen to you today because we also are part of the partnership we are overwhelming and we're glad we've assessed a lot of help from NDC partnership and we're starting very soon. And my question is this: they came to Nigeria for scoping mission, and we did all of our challenges and all that, and action, and we've been receiving support from there. Is there any template for reporting back in individual access to funding for NDC implementation? And what processes do we have to take? Is it by donor, or there is a template that collates all the donors and will report back to UNDP NDC support? Thank you.
Thank you. The second for gentleman.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My question also relates...
Please identify
Oh.
your name and from where.
Yes, my name is Naveed. I'm supporting the delegation of Palau. My question goes to the representative from Singapore as well. Your carbon taxation seems to be addressing multiple sectors of your emissions reductions plan. However, you set a price of $5 on your carbon price. I was curious as to, and maybe the UK and the NDC, I know a lot of NDCs are mentioning carbon pricing as one of the mechanisms to reduce carbon emissions. However, we have such a wide range of carbon pricing, anywhere from $1 to $127 by the government of Sweden. Is there what was the kind of thought process in coming to meeting that level of pricing as $5 is the initial starting point, which aims to grow, and then is that enough? Is that going to allow for the level reductions that you aim to have by 2030, or should you have started at a higher price, as perhaps the EU or the UK is doing in terms of its emissions trading scheme? And so, thank you.
Thank you. And then the third gentleman.
Yes, hello, my name is Agung from Indonesia. Actually, my questions are more or less the same as our colleagues before. It's more on the carbon tax. In particular, how does it operationalize in Singapore and how actually it fits to the NDC? Just basically want to know how it works or how it will work if it's not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you. The fourth lady in front.
My name is Dunia Hassan Khalafallah from Sudan, Ministry of Agriculture. I am specialized in agriculture and environment expert. My question about, at first, thank you for your intensive presentation. I like it. You talk about you are targeting at 2030 about 2 GWP and for solar. Okay, you are targeting this number. My question is about when you start producing solar energy. How much you start the beginning of it, and what about the prices of it for the consumer? Thank you.
Thank you. The last one. Yeah, the lady. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alice Suido. I stayed in Singapore and Indonesia for part of my life. My first question is for NDCs in the EU. One big criticism about NDCs is that the sum of carbon reductions does not meet the whole target of the 1.5 degree target. So from your talk, it does seem that NDCs are progressive and they can be enhanced, but countries seem to request for assistance from your organization and not the other way around. How is your organization ensuring that countries are ambitious enough to meet our carbon goals? And for Singapore, I was wondering, the issues of taxes is that large corporations are able to pay for the carbon tax. I was wondering why Singapore was not interested in doing a cap and trade such that there is a ultimate sum of how much carbon Singapore is willing to emit. Thank you.
Thank you. So there are 5 questions. So most of them asking about carbon tax, Ms. Lee. So I think it's better to give you first step, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for all the questions that were directed about our carbon tax. Just to share, this was a journey that we began, I would say, quite some years ago, maybe even as far back as 10 years ago, when we already indicated that by our Prime Minister that carbon would need to be priced at some point in the future. And this was already said many years back. Back in 2013, we enacted an act which actually required large emitters to measure and report how much emissions they are actually producing. And this laid the groundwork. MRV is a very important building block towards being able to tax carbon emissions in any meaningful way. And in a sense, the legislation that is put in place is actually a culmination of that journey to build up capacity amongst the emitters, so that by the time we actually roll out the Carbon Tax Act, the companies that are going to be hit by this carbon tax already have the capabilities in place to be able to measure and to report. And so this journey actually began some years back, and we had been in conversation with the various industry players that would be hit. Our power generators are also hit, which means that the users of electricity, which would include the man on the street, would also actually be impacted to some degree by the carbon tax. However, it just so happened that just as we were rolling out the carbon tax, this also coincided with the time when we were liberalizing our retail market for electricity. And so the overall impact on the consumers of this carbon tax was probably fairly negligible. The question about how it is that we decided to set our tax rate at $5, as I mentioned during my presentation, this $5 is an introductory price, so to speak, and we've given all the industry the certainty that this price will be held for the next 5 years, and there will be a review in 2023 with the intention to double to triple this tax rate by 2030. We were the first in the region, in the Southeast Asian region, to actually put a price on carbon, and we decided to start with a carbon tax, which was simple and straightforward, and we did it with no exemptions and no allowances, and it's got a very high economy-wide coverage. But we also implemented it using a fixed price credit mechanism system. And so the intention is that eventually we will study the possibility of actually allowing some international credits to be used for the tax purposes. And perhaps in the longer term, we will also study the possibility of linking up Singapore's regime with other jurisdictions. I think there was a question as well on solar. From 2014 to 2018, our solar deployment actually increased by more than 6 times. And so we started from a very low base, and even today we are at slightly over 200 megawatt peak. And so to be aiming to go from 200 over megawatt peak to more than at least 2 gigawatt peak by 2030 is a stretch target, but we hope to be able to hit at least 2 gigawatt peak and push the boundaries further.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. And I'd like to ask Mr. Robert Lee from NDC Partnerships.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions I think that either were directed to me or that I could pick up on. First of all, from the question from Nigeria. So thank you very much, and it's we're extremely excited and inspired by what Nigeria is doing, and delighted to be working together. And indeed, it's worth noting that I don't want to speak on behalf of Nigeria, but amongst the requests for which we're aligning support are around development and alignment with long-term strategy. So that's, I think, in the context of today's discussion, a great example of where there is that long-term thinking as well as the near-term questions of how we implement today's NDC. The question was about reporting to donors, and that's this is within the partnership, we're obviously trying to align support from all sorts of different places. Different intergovernmental organizations and different development partners do have their own reporting strategies, and we don't entirely do away with the need to do those kinds of reporting. However, what we do by working together with the partnership plan is to set a common set of indicators that everybody agrees on in terms of what we're trying to achieve, what the country is aiming to achieve. And so that hopefully simplifies the process in that we're starting throughout from an agreed set of objectives that the government has clearly endorsed and that the partners are converging around. So part of what we hope to achieve with that kind of collaboration is to make that process somewhat more streamlined, somewhat more straightforward and intuitive for the partners involved. It's also an important way in which I think the government can hold its partners to account for, we all agreed that through this plan we want to achieve A, B, and C. One of the things that we do, the partnership has a monitoring and evaluation framework, and we will be collectively holding ourselves accountable to, are we actually supporting our member countries in making the progress that was identified in both implementation and enhancement. So that's something that we hope the partnership makes a little bit more straightforward. The second question was really the one around the NDC's ambition and the nature of and need for support. So it is a design feature of the Paris Agreement, of course, that the commitments that countries are bringing forward are bottom-up. They are ones that start with, as the name suggests, the nationally determined activities that countries feel that they can bring. There's a strong advantage to that, which is that countries are not negotiating a target in a foreign capital and then coming back and trying to sell it domestically. They are coming with things that have buy-in from domestic players and therefore are much more likely to be implemented. There's a downside to it, which is that as with any bottom-up process, we're not automatically going to arrive straight at the total aggregate effort that we need in order to hit the ambitious targets of the Paris Agreement in terms of 2 or 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's why the process of NDC enhancement on a 5-year timetable exists and why it was designed into the Paris Agreement. And so this is really a critical time. This is where I think we test the basic proposition that countries are able to look at where we are, clearly well short of the aggregate effort that's actually needed, and bring forward additional actions that help set us on a pathway to a more sustainable future. And this is, let's not sugarcoat it. I mean, these are the big moments that decide whether the Paris Agreement is a success or not. And what's inspiring is seeing so many countries start to step up and start to look for these opportunities, but we're clearly not there yet. And we clearly have major players who also need to take significant additional steps if we're going to stay within safe planetary limits. On the question of support, again, it's built into the Paris Agreement that developing countries, and indeed into the convention, that developing countries are entitled to support in order to be able to take forward the actions that they take on. Now, that is clearly differentiated in practice. Many countries are moving a lot of action without support, but it is within the Paris Agreement, and I would say that it's in line with the spirit of equity and burden sharing that was embodied in the convention, that countries are entitled to expect that. And so what we have is many countries who have said, listen, we can do this much on our own. And what's very inspiring actually is to see countries, including small island states, including LDCs, already allocating domestic budgets to driving action forward. But in addition, saying with support, we can do this much more. And that support could be technical, it could be in terms of capacity building services, or it could be in terms of actually mobilizing the finance needed. Now, obviously, again, more is always needed, but getting that support and getting it right and making it effective is still a critical part of the overall picture of making the Paris Agreement a success. And that, I think, we're starting to see come together.
Thank you.
Please, Mr. Davis.
I'll just speak briefly. As I said at the beginning, unfortunately, I'm slightly limited in what I can say because of our pre-election period, but just a couple of brief reflections. I think I majored at the beginning on kind of what we need to do together through the NDCs to raise our ambition towards the long-term targets. But I think what's very clear and what we've been discussing here is how we need to look at everything together in terms of building capacity. And one particular element is that kind of learning of lessons of those who've been done before. You'll be aware that the UK doesn't have its own NDC. We're part of the EU NDC, and we're part of the EU emissions trading scheme, which was set up many years ago. It's almost as old as the Climate Change Act that we have in the UK. And so there's a lot of lessons that we can learn there, and we need to be open about kind of the lessons that have been learned, the things that weren't quite got right. And that's what we're open to do. And also in terms of specific elements of building capacity as well. Initiatives like the NDC partnership are absolutely crucial. But there are other elements as well. There were multiple questions around carbon prices and market mechanisms. One of the other elements that we're trying to do is our funding for raising capacity on markets, for example, through the Partnership for Market Readiness, where the UK, we provide about 120 million, I think, for different programs on that way forward. We know that it's in every single area we need to work together to build capacity to take forward the NDCs towards ambition. So it's an important part of the conversation, and just wanted to emphasize that that's something that's on our mind as well.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think as we come into the finish of the sessions, but I have some notes that probably we can share. First, based on DG Climate Change of Indonesia, we know that the NDC is kind of country commitments and also mentioned clearly in Article 4 of Paris Agreement. And the basis of the NDC is CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, respective capabilities. And we also heard from the presentation from Chile and from Singapore how different their approaches. We don't mind about that because every country has its own characteristic. But at least by understanding and learning lesson from each country, we can enrich our capacity and knowledge about reaching the NDC for the global target. And we also heard from the NDC partnership, there are some opportunities that countries can ask NDC to give us support in producing a good NDC in the futures. And one thing that I also like to raise the interesting thing is from Singapore, meaning that everybody is sometimes seeing this is the burden for countries, but Singapore see that this is the opportunity. I think it's a different angle, and again, it's not always the burden, not always the problem, but also we have to see the opportunity. Thank you very much for the speaker, and again, thank you very much for everybody. Please take applause.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wahyudi, for being the moderator for today's session. There will be the token of appreciation will be given by Mr. Rwanda Agung Sugardiman. The certificate is made of recycled paper. And we will have a photo session. Okay. Please join for the photo session at the center of the stage. round of applause to all speakers and the moderator. That was a very fascinating session. Thank you for all speakers. And after this, we still have another session. Please, for all the audience to stay in here because we shortly will begin the next session with the title of Building Climate Resiliency from the Villages. So everyone, please take a seat and we'll begin shortly after this. Thank you.